Who could believe, looking at life in France in 1914, that the country, along with the whole of Europe, was about to be struck by one of the most terrible tragedies in history? It is true that Alsace-Lorraine was still an unhealed wound, and that there was bitter hatred of the Germans, still known by the insulting name of Les Boches. But nobody really thought that war was possible. There had been peace for nearly 45 years. It was the time of the Franco-Russian alliance, and the Entente Cordiale had replaced the old rivalry with Britain. But the danger was there. Europe's peace was an armed one. The Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a place in the sun. The Parisian crowd filled the Avenue du Bois. Paris danced in the beautiful summer of 1914. And then a spark set everything aflame.
In 1918 was the last year of the war. Both sides were exhausted by the conflict. In Britain, France and Germany, there was a looming shortage of manpower, caused by enormous casualties, forcing a wider conscription. All sides had reached a point that new drafts were not going to be enough to replace the losses. For the Allies, this problem was mitigated by the fact that the United States had entered the war the year before. Some 3 million men were due to join the British and French on the Western Front. In August 1914, Britain was the sole major European power not to have conscription. Although there was a tremendous wave of patriotic fervour to join up, compulsory military service remained an anathema to British politicians and public alike. But despite the public enthusiasm for volunteers, the numbers that came forward were insufficient to make up the losses on various British battlefronts around the world. But it wasn't until January 1916 that the British government introduced the first in a series of military service acts which set out call-up regulations. The Act of January 1916 specified that men from the ages of 18 to 41 were liable to be called up for service unless they were married or widowed with children, or else served in one of a number of reserved professions. Within 4 months, a revised version of the Act was passed. This enabled the War Office in London to extend the service of time-expired servicemen and call up all men, regardless of marital status, from the ages of 18 to 41. The government also gained the right to re-examine men previously declared medically unfit for service. The Act was revised again in January 1918, as the demand for human war material was insatiable. This enabled the government to quash all exemptions from military service on occupational grounds at its own discretion. And where exemptions from service had been withdrawn, the standard 2-month grace period was abolished. Three months later, in April 1918, at the height of the Great German Spring Offensive on the Western Front, a 5th version of the Act was published. Its most notable provision extended age eligibility so that men aged from 17 to 51 could be called up. In addition, the Act was, for the first time, to be applied to men in Ireland, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. Between August 1914 and the introduction of the first Military Service Act, as many as 3 million men volunteered for military service. From January 1916 until the close of the war, a further 2.3 million men were formally conscripted into service. As the factories were emptied of men, so women took their place at the machines. Millions of women saw it as their chance to contribute to the war effort. Women found employment in transport, on the rail lines and driving buses and trams. Nursing, factories making ammunition, the Women's Royal Air Force, where they worked on planes as mechanics, on farms in the Women's Land Army, in shipyards and so on. Before 1914, these jobs, with the exception of nursing, had been for men only. It is hardly surprising then that women were reluctant to return to domestic routine at the end of the war. They felt they had earned the right to play an equal role in rebuilding the world after the war. For men returning from the trenches, it was another reminder of how much the world had changed while they were away, and many found it hard to accept. Germany had also eased its manpower problems following Russia's revolution and collapse. By early March, the Russians had agreed an armistice with the Germans, but at huge cost in terms of territory and material supplies. Following the Russians' collapse, the Germans were able to transfer the armies in the east to France. With 500,000 troops added to Germany's strength from the Russian front, Ludendorff was confident of success. But German High Command under Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff were acutely aware that time was not on their side following the arrival of the American forces. Realistically, a decisive German victory was unlikely, but if they were to mount a series of offensives in quick succession, then they might be able to negotiate more favorable terms. The Germans had also been developing their tactics. Instead of sending massed ranks of men along a broad front, they began developing special units of storm troops. These soldiers traveled lightly and were skilled in fast, hard-hitting attacks before moving on to the next target. Unlike soldiers burdened with weighty kit, the stormtroopers carried little except weaponry, such as flamethrowers, which could cause much panic. Their role was to punch through sections of the line and keep going to attack the reserves. Other forces would then feed through to attack the defenders from behind. By the spring of 1918, the Allies knew that there would be a major German attack. They just did not know where it would come. The British reinforced their positions near the coast, while the French strengthened their positions to the south of the British. However, this left a weakness in the British line to the west of Cambrai. Here the British trench system had not been completed, and those that had been dug were inadequate. Sir Hubert Gough, who commanded the Fifth Army in this area, was well aware of this predicament, and more conscious of the fact that he had few reserves to call on if the Germans did attack the sector where the Fifth Army was stationed. German reconnaissance had made them aware that the area was less well defended. The Germans' aim was to drive a wedge between the British and French, making it difficult for them to make a coordinated counterattack. Their main objective was to take Ames, which was a major rail junction for the rail network in western France. On March 31st, 1918, Ludendorff launched the offensive. In just 5 hours, the Germans fired 1 million artillery shells at the British lines, held by the Fifth Army. Over 3,000 shells fired every minute. The artillery bombardment was followed by an attack by elite stormtroopers. By the end of the first day of the attack, 21,000 British soldiers had been taken prisoner, and the Germans had made great advances through the lines of the Fifth Army. Senior British commanders lost control of the situation. They had spent 3 years used to static warfare, and suddenly they had to cope with a German onslaught. Gough ordered the Fifth Army to withdraw. The German attack was the biggest breakthrough in 3 years of warfare on the Western Front. Ironically, the British gave up to the Germans the Somme region, where so many British and German soldiers had been killed in the Battle of 1916. For the first time since trench warfare had begun in 1914, the British Army had been defeated. But there was more to come. Within 5 days, the Germans had recaptured all the terrain around the Somme, lost in the previous 2 years, ground that had been fought over at such high cost. Within 10 days, they were at the gates of their main objective, Ames. But hastily thrown defences using reserves and French troops rushed up from the south, gradually slowed the German advance. In April, the Germans struck again, this time to the north of the River Lys. Once again, they made spectacular progress, smashing their way through a Portuguese division. In the rear lines, they found tired British divisions, recovering from the mauling they'd endured in March. The British Expeditionary Force had known hard times before, but this was different, and Haig issued a personal message to the troops, the only time he did so during the entire war. In it, he made clear that their backs were to the wall, and thus they should be prepared to fight to the end. With French help, the Germans were halted. British losses had been substantial, and these could only be made up with newly conscripted 18-year-olds. Ludendorff knew he had to keep the Allies on the wrong foot, and so he then switched his attention to attacking in the south. His aim was to draw Allied forces south so that he could resume the attack in the north. The attack was launched early on the 27th of May with a ferocious heavy artillery bombardment of 4,000 guns. Over 2 million shells had been stockpiled for the bombardment across a 40-kilometer front. Owing to the heavy concentration of primarily British troops in the front-line trenches, casualties from the bombardment were severe. The bombardment was accompanied by a gas attack designed to disable defensive gun crews, after which 17 divisions of German infantry under Crown Prince Wilhelm began their advance through a 40-kilometer gap in the Allied line. With the Allied forces entirely taken by surprise, the rapid progress of the German troops was reminiscent of the more fluid war of movement of the opening months of the war. Between Soissons and Rheims, the Germans broke through a further 8 Allied divisions, 4 British, 4 French, reaching the Aisne in under 6 hours. By the end of the first day, the Germans had gained 15 kilometers of territory and had reached the River Vesle. By the 30th of May, the Germans had managed to capture 50,000 Allied soldiers and 800 guns, arriving within 90 kilometers of Paris by the 3rd of June. They also began to bombard Paris itself, using a huge railway-mounted gun called Big Bertha. Big Bertha was the largest artillery piece in the world, capable of dropping an 820-kilogram shell from 75 miles away. She was one of 4 large guns that played a central role in destroying the Belgian forts in the first weeks of 1914. Although she was a fearsome weapon, her actual impact was more psychological than physical. But just as it seemed as if the Allies were defeated, the offensive began running out of steam. At the front, the German troops, underfed with poor quality food, could not believe their eyes as they stormed into Allied-held villages and towns. Control and discipline broke down as soldiers set about looting the shops for any luxuries that could be carried away. Also, the conditions in the trenches, coupled with a poor diet, meant that the soldiers were prone to infections. In June 1918, some 500,000 German troops were struck down by the first wave of Spanish influenza, which would go on to claim some 50 million lives worldwide immediately after the war. Another problem was that the further the Germans advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became. Finally, the British blockade of German ports was now biting hard, and Germany had simply run out of the raw materials it needed to make weapons and ammunition. The failure of the Michael offensive meant that Germany had now little chance of winning the war. The Allies, meanwhile, had put all their forces under the single command of General Foch. Tanks, aircraft, artillery and infantry were integrated into coordinated plans with achievable objectives, something the Germans never fully mastered. Elsewhere, the war was beginning to contract. The Austro-Hungarians were on the point of bankruptcy and starvation. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire had been defeated. And at home, many Germans were tired of the war. All they wanted was food and democracy. But the Allies were still going to have to force the Germans out of France. In what began as the last major German offensive of the First World War, the Second Battle of the Marne developed into a significant Allied victory. After it became clear that the Germans had not only failed in their aim to win the war in this offensive, but had in fact lost ground, a number of German commanders, including Crown Prince Wilhelm, believed the war was lost. On the day of the offensive's launch, on the 15th of July, 23 German divisions of the 1st and 3rd Armies attacked the French 4th Army to the east of Rheims, while a further 17 divisions of the 7th Army and the new 9th Army attacked the French 6th Army in the west. In attacking Rheims in this way, Ludendorff aimed to split the French forces. Joining the French were 85,000 US forces, plus troops from Sir Douglas Haig's British Expeditionary Force, although the majority of the latter's forces were located further north in Flanders. The attack to the east quickly proved a failure and was halted at 11 AM on the first day without being resumed. However, the offensive to the west of Rheims was more successful, breaking through the French 6th Army and crossing the Marne. The Germans established a bridgehead 9 miles in length and 4 in depth before the French 9th Army, supported by British, American and Italian troops, halted its advance on the 17th of July. With the Germans having ultimately failed in their efforts to break through, Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, authorized a counter-offensive. On the 18th of July, 24 divisions of the French army, in addition to US, British and Italian troops, and some 350 tanks, launched their counter-offensive. Foch's aim was to eliminate the large German salient. In this he was entirely successful. The French 10th Army and 6th Army led the attack, advancing 5 miles on the first day alone. Meanwhile, the French 5th Army and 9th Army launched subsidiary attacks in the west. July, the Germans ordered a retreat. By the 3rd of August, they were back where they had started, the launch of the Great Spring Offensive, at the Aisne-Vesle rivers. The Allied counter-offensive was finally halted on the 6th of August by the now solidly entrenched Germans. As a consequence of the disastrous result in Marne, Ludendorff's planned Flanders offensive was initially postponed, then entirely cancelled. No further large-scale attempt to win the war was undertaken. The American First Army was now beginning to make its presence felt. Its first offensive had been launched at Cantigny on the 28th of May. Troops of the US 1st Division advanced supported by French tanks and heavy artillery. In the face of 7 severe counterattacks that day and the next, the US forces held their position with the loss of 1,067 casualties. They captured around 100 German prisoners. The American success at Cantigny was followed by attacks at Château-Thierry and Belle-Île Wood in the first half of June. The failure of the spring offensive meant that the Germans were now on the defensive. At the beginning of August, the Allies began a series of offensives aimed at keeping the Germans off balance. As soon as they began stabilizing in one sector, another offensive would be launched in another. The Americans were to play a significant role in this final phase of the war. On the 8th of August, the British Fourth Army launched an attack on the Aisne front, preceded by over 300 heavy tanks. Armour, artillery, aircraft and infantry fought as one with dramatic results. By the end of the month, they faced the mighty defences of the Hindenburg Line. Until now, American units have been lent piecemeal to the Allies, much against Pershing's wish to have US soldiers fighting under American command. At the beginning of September, he got his way, and the First American Army came into being. It was deployed to the south of Verdun at Saint-Mihiel. The concentration of troops for a major offensive began at once. The Saint-Mihiel salient, which had been formed in the fall of 1914, seriously hampered French rail communications between Paris and the eastern segments of the front. Pershing assembled 300,000 troops for what was to be America's first offensive in the war. But the German High Command, aware the attack was coming, ordered a partial withdrawal of troops. The withdrawal was still in progress when the US Army attacked on the 12th of September. A secondary assault by 110,000 French troops took place 3 hours later. Over 1,400 aircraft under the command of General William "Billy" Mitchell supported the advancing US and French troops. This was to be the largest air assault of the war. On the first day, the main attack advanced 9 kilometers to reach Fagnecourt, and the French troops captured the village of Dommartin. By the 16th of September, the entire Saint-Mihiel salient was under Allied control. German morale was at an all-time low. The realization that German resources could not hope to match the might of American industry, now firmly on a war footing, made the war pointless and undermined the resolution of the ordinary soldier. It was in this gloomy mood that the Germans retired behind the Hindenburg Line at the beginning of September. That it followed the line of the German gains from 1914 only served to emphasize the pointlessness of the war. Since the start of the spring offensive, Germany had lost 1 million men, losses it could not hope to replace. Following the success at Ames, the Allies continued to launch their offensives up and down the Western Front. Finally, on September the 26th, the BEF smashed through the Hindenburg Line. Two days later, the Allies had crossed the Saint-Quentin Canal, which formed a seemingly impregnable part of the German defenses. Fighting was in progress all the way from the North Sea to Switzerland. It was naturally more intense wherever the Allies applied the greatest pressure. As the British were attacking the Hindenburg Line, French and American forces launched the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Using several ruses to deceive the Germans into thinking the offensive would head towards Metz in the north, the US First Army began to form in the area around the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. At 5:30 in the afternoon of September the 26th, the American First Army jumped off with the French holding their flanks. Following a rolling barrage of artillery fire, the US First Army crashed through the German defences. The US Third Corps pushed its way into the German second defensive line, although the Fifth Corps was stopped at Montfaucon during the first day. To add to the pressure on the Germans, Italy launched a major offensive at Vittorio Veneto, which would end in defeat for the Austro-Hungarian forces and the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. The combined Italian force totaled a sizable 57 divisions, of which 3 were British and 2 were French, along with a single US regiment. Ranged against them were 52 nominal Austro-Hungarian divisions. In terms of artillery, the Italians also held the advantage, with 7,700 guns to 6,030. Crucially, Italian morale was notably higher than the thoroughly demoralized Austro-Hungarian force. The attack opened on the 23rd of October 1918, with an Italian advance in the mountains. However, the extent of Austro-Hungarian resistance surprised Diaz and succeeded in preventing any significant Italian gains, although the Austro-Hungarians were obliged to bring up reserves from the lower Piave. Such reserves could be ill afforded given that the main Italian advance began the same day in the lower Piave. With the Allies succeeding in advancing 24 kilometers along a 56-kilometer front, a truce was finally agreed on the 2nd of November with the capture of Tagliamento. An armistice came into effect the following day, signed at Padua. Hostilities were formally concluded on the 4th of November 1918. A resounding success for the Allies, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto finished the Austro-Hungarian army as a fighting force. The Italians lost some 38,000 casualties, a figure dwarfed by the 300,000 prisoners suffered by the Austro-Hungarians. With Germany's allies Bulgaria and Turkey also seeking an armistice, it was only a matter of time before Germany would also have to give up the struggle, especially as France and American forces were now threatening to advance into Germany itself. To add to the pressure was an escalating atmosphere of unrest among the civilian population, worn down by years of deprivation. Sailors at the German fleet's port of Kiel mutinied on November the 3rd. They had heard rumours of a plan to sail for one last time and confront the Royal Navy in open seas. It would have been a suicide mission, and the sailors would have none of it. Soon the mutiny began to spread and riots broke out in numerous German cities. Revolution now swept through the streets. Ludendorff had resigned, and approaches had been made to the United States seeking an armistice. Initiating the armistice negotiations on the 4th of October 1918, the Germans directed peace feelers towards the US government, led by President Wilson. Wilson was naturally willing to conclude a peace based upon his doctrine for future peace and stability. However, his allies raised immediate objections. Britain, led by Lloyd George, opposed a ban on the policy of blockades. France was intent on imposing swingeing reparations upon the beaten foe. Wilson compromised by accepting both objections, whilst threatening to negotiate a separate peace on behalf of the US if Britain and France continued with their objections. His ploy successful. Details of a proposed settlement were sent to Germany on the 5th of November by the Supreme War Council. A major potential stumbling block to peace was Wilson's insistence upon the abdication of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. This was overcome by German Chancellor Max von Baden's exacerbated decision to announce a reluctant Wilhelm's abdication to the public on the 9th of November 1918. On the 8th of November, a German delegation met with Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch, who was to lead the military negotiations, in the forest of Compiègne, some 65 kilometers northeast of Paris. The armistice was signed at 5 a.m. on the morning of 11th November 1918 and came into effect 6 hours later at 11 a.m., forever remembered as the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The armistice initially ran for 30 days, but was regularly renewed until the formal peace treaty was signed at Versailles the following year. Should the Germans have deviated in any way from the terms of the armistice, the Allies warned that a resumption of hostilities would begin within 48 hours. The terms of the armistice required the Germans to evacuate German-occupied territories on the Western Front within 2 weeks. Allied forces were to occupy the left bank of the Rhine within a month, and a neutral zone established on the right bank. Notably, all German-occupied territories elsewhere were to be abandoned, and the treaties already negotiated with Russia and Romania were officially annulled. In terms of military equipment, under the terms of the armistice, the Germans lost 5,000 artillery pieces, 30,000 machine guns, 2,000 aircraft, 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 railway wagons, 5,000 trucks, and its entire submarine fleet. The majority of Germany's surface naval fleet was interned, the remainder being disbanded. In June 1919, the German Navy scuttled its ships in the British anchorage at Scapa Flow. The terms of the armistice were inevitably seen as punitive within Germany. The country, however, was in no condition to resume hostilities, and so reluctantly accepted the conditions. The French nevertheless viewed the terms of the armistice and the Versailles Peace Treaty that followed in 1919 as overly lenient, indicating the widely contrasting views of both the armistice and the subsequent treaty. The catastrophic war was at an end. Whilst there was joy when the armistice began, it was more out of relief than exhilaration that the exhausted troops celebrated the coming of peace. Little had been gained, but much lost in the 4 years of war. The once great empires of Russia, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans and Germany were broken up. The British Empire, having borrowed huge amounts of money in order to buy war materials and food, faced economic crisis. Areas of France where most of the battles had been fought have been reduced to virtual wastelands and would also require vast sums of cash to rebuild the shattered country. French negotiators looked to Germany to make good French losses. To determine the amount that Germany was to pay, the Allied Reparations Commission was established. They toured France, Belgium and parts of England to determine the damage done by the war. In April of 1921, the Commission announced the final bill that Germany was required to pay. The total was established at 132 billion gold German marks. The German government was to pay the debt off in installments of 2.5 billion gold mark per year. The final payment was to occur in 1961. Germany made its first payment in 1921, but by 1922 the economy of the country had collapsed and was facing hyperinflation. Although Britain agreed to a 3-year break, Belgium and France would not, and began seizing German factories in compensation. Some 16 million men had gone to war, of whom 10 million were killed. For those who returned, they found that many aspects of the world they had left behind had changed beyond recognition. For example, women only held minor jobs before the Great War. They could be maids or cooks, but were limited beyond these roles. As a result of the war, they took on most of the traditional jobs held by men. Women began delivering the mail and coal, driving buses, ploughing fields and making explosives. Many changes occurred for women that allowed them access to different jobs, better pay and more freedom within society. The men returning from the front lines after the war were shocked by many of these changes. But in the heart of Europe, there lay a shattered Germany, harboring a grievous sense of humiliation and injustice. There were many former soldiers who mistakenly believed they had not lost the war on the battlefield, but due to traitors at home. The combination of these sentiments, coupled with economic collapse, only fueled the turmoil. Ultimately, Germany's predicament created a fertile ground for extremists. It was a situation that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party were to exploit to such disastrous effect, plunging the world into another far more catastrophic world war in 1939.